The last thing Evan Carter expected after a flawless morning of tennis was to find 3 6-year-old boys drawing dinosaurs and smiley faces all over his luxury car. But what truly stopped him cold wasn't the chalk, it was their faces. Identical. Familiar. And the woman sitting nearby, quietly reading, who looked like a ghost from the life he thought he'd left behind. Evan Carter never missed a tennis morning. It was his one untouchable ritual, tucked neatly between high-stakes meetings and business calls. He liked the control it gave him, the predictability of the game, the silence of early courts and the sound of a clean serve. That morning was no different, until it was. After a quick warm-up and a few sets with his trainer, Evan walked back toward the parking lot, towel draped over his shoulder, expecting nothing more than a quiet ride to his office and the usual onslaught of emails. But the moment he turned the corner, he stopped in his tracks. 3 small boys, around 6 years old, were crouched in front of his matte black Porsche. All of them had chalk in their hands, one red, one blue, one green, and they were drawing. Not on the pavement, not near the tires, but directly on the car. The hood now had a wonky sun, the driver's side door was home to a shaky but detailed dinosaur, and the windshield had a big, "Hi" scrawled across it in rainbow letters. They didn't notice him right away. They were focused, completely absorbed in their masterpiece. Evan felt something between disbelief and outrage rise in his chest. This was a custom-painted, limited-edition sports car. The kind of car people didn't even lean on, let alone treat like a sidewalk canvas. He took a step forward, his jaw already tightening, but then one of the boys turned. The child had soft, reddish-brown curls and wide brown eyes that blinked up at him without fear. A second later, the other 2 turned too, triplets, unmistakably. Identical expressions, identical eyes, identical curls, though each had his own energy. One looked startled, the second defiant, the third grinned without hesitation. It threw Evan off balance. They were adorable, yes, but more than that, they were eerily familiar. There was something about the shape of their eyes, the way one of them furrowed his brow, the way another tilted his head with quiet defiance, it struck Evan like a distant echo of something he couldn't place. He cleared his throat, not entirely sure what to say. "Where are your parents?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. One of the boys pointed casually toward a bench shaded by a large tree. "Our mom's reading," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Evan followed the direction of the boy's finger. There, sitting alone, was a woman with a book resting in her lap, her head tilted slightly as she turned the page. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands curling along her cheekbones, and she wore a long cardigan over jeans and sneakers. She looked completely at peace, completely unaware, or perhaps completely unbothered, by what her sons were doing. Evan narrowed his eyes, something catching in his chest. There was something about her posture, the way she moved her hand as she turned the page, the way her face looked calm but just slightly tired. He started walking toward her, still holding the towel in his hand, footsteps heavier than before. The closer he got, the louder his heart began to pound, not out of anger, but confusion. Because when she finally looked up from the book and met his eyes, everything around him stopped. It was Claire. Claire Donovan. He hadn't seen her in over 6 years. Not since their abrupt ending. Not since she disappeared from his life without a real goodbye. And now, here she was. Sitting on a bench. Watching 3 children who looked like someone he might have been. The towel slipped slightly from his shoulder, but he didn't move to catch it. Claire blinked as if she wasn't sure she was seeing him right. "Evan," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakable. And in that moment, the only thought in his mind was one he wasn't ready to admit out loud: those boys weren't just familiar. They looked like him. Claire stood slowly from the bench, her book forgotten on the seat beside her, hands clenched at her sides as she looked at Evan like she was seeing a ghost. Her expression flickered between shock, guilt, and something else, something closer to quiet dread. Evan didn't speak right away. Neither did she. The air between them was heavy with unfinished history, words never spoken, and time that had passed too loudly to be ignored. The boys, unaware of the storm gathering between the adults, continued their playful banter behind him, now giggling as they drew mustaches on the car's headlights. Evan took a breath, grounding himself. He hadn't expected to see Claire again. He hadn't thought about her for a long time, or at least that's what he'd convinced himself. But the moment her eyes met his, all of it came back. The way she used to laugh into his chest. The way she would fall asleep mid-sentence, curled into him like the world couldn't touch her there. And the way she had left. No call. No message. Just silence. He had buried that hurt under years of building walls and climbing ladders. And now she was standing in front of him like no time had passed. Except it had. And clearly, it hadn't passed alone. He glanced back at the boys again, taking them in with new clarity. All three of them had his eyes. His cheekbones. The middle one even had his crooked grin. Evan turned to Claire fully, voice quieter than he intended. Are they mine? Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked down, one hand tightening around her wrist, and then back up. Can we talk? She asked, nodding toward a path that led away from the courts. Evan didn't respond, but his feet moved. They walked in silence for a few moments until the sounds of the boys faded behind them. They reached a quieter corner of the park where the trees stretched wide overhead and the sun filtered gently through the branches. Claire stopped and finally looked at him, really looked. No, she said softly. They're not yours. Evan blinked, momentarily stunned by the simplicity of the answer. He opened his mouth to speak, but she continued. I found out I was pregnant about 2 weeks after you left for London. I tried to call. I emailed. But you had changed numbers. Your assistant screened everything. I thought maybe it wasn't meant to be. I told myself it was better for everyone if I didn't push. I didn't want to beg you to come back. And I didn't want to raise them with resentment between us. So you didn't even try to tell me again? Evan asked, his voice sharp but not loud. Claire, I would've. Would you? She cut in, not unkindly. Would you have left your job, your company, your plans, to come back for someone who was pregnant with triplets? The question hung between them. Not as an accusation, but as a real, raw uncertainty. Evan didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't sure what the truth was. Maybe back then, the version of him that boarded a plane to London would have run. Maybe that Evan wouldn't have known how to handle 3 lives growing inside someone he hadn't planned on building a future with. But they're not mine, he said, more to confirm it to himself than anything. They're not yours, Claire repeated. Their father left before they were even born. He said he wasn't built for this. I believed him. And honestly, I'm glad he's gone. It made me stronger. It made me their only constant. Evan looked at her, not with pity, but with something like awe. Raising one child alone was difficult. 3. It was nearly impossible. And yet she had done it. Without complaint. Without help. Without him. Why are you here? She asked suddenly. Why now? He looked at her, then back in the direction of the boys, and then returned his gaze to her face. I wasn't looking for you, he admitted. I didn't even know you were in the same city. I was just playing tennis. And then I saw them. Saw you. And something stopped me. Claire exhaled slowly. Well, here we are. Evan nodded. Yeah. Here we are. Neither of them knew what the next step was. But they both knew the moment had shifted something permanent. The past wasn't gone. The answers weren't simple. But the connection that once tied them together hadn't vanished. It had only gone quiet. And now, it was beginning to speak again. Later that evening, Evan sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by glass walls and breathtaking views that felt more distant than ever before. The city sparkled beneath him, but it didn't touch him. Nothing did. The silence in the room was heavy, not peaceful like it used to be, but suffocating. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the day. The chalk drawings. The identical boys. Claire's voice. The weight of her choices. And his own. He had come home not knowing what to feel. He wasn't angry, not exactly. But he was unsettled in a way he hadn't been in years. He poured himself a drink, something he rarely did outside of business dinners, and stood by the window, staring out into the city he'd conquered. It felt ridiculous now, how much effort he had put into this image of control and precision. What good had it done him? He had money, power, real estate in 4 countries, and not a single moment in that entire day had meant more than the one where a 6-year-old had grinned at him with a chalk-stained hand and eyes that looked too much like his own. He hadn't expected them to be his. But part of him, some small, unspoken part, had wanted them to be. And when Claire said they weren't, something inside him cracked open. Not from relief. From loss. He sat down at the edge of his leather sofa, elbows on his knees, the glass still in his hand. He hadn't seen Claire in 6 years, but she'd haunted parts of him in ways he'd refused to admit. He remembered her laughter, her stubborn optimism, the way she challenged his cold logic without ever yelling. She was the only woman he had ever let close enough to leave a mark. And he had convinced himself she'd simply vanished, that she'd chosen to disappear. But now, seeing her again, seeing what she had built, who she had become, it was like time folded in on itself. And then there were the boys. He couldn't stop thinking about them. The way they stood close together like a unit, the way they finished each other's sentences, how they were clearly mischievous and curious and full of energy. They weren't his, but it didn't matter. They existed. They were part of her. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to know them. Not as an obligation. Not to fix anything. Just to be near them. Evan had never been someone who longed for a family. His childhood had been a map of distance, boarding schools, nannies, empty houses with long dinner tables. His father had taught him how to lead but never how to care. His mother had loved him, he supposed, but from a far-off place, always preoccupied, always a bit distracted. He had promised himself a different life. A better one. But he had filled it with things instead of people. And now, for the first time, he felt the emptiness of that decision. He reached for his phone but stopped himself before calling Claire. What would he say? He didn't have answers. He wasn't ready to ask for anything. He wasn't even sure what he wanted from her, or from the children. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to pretending he didn't care. He set the glass down and stood up. His reflection in the window stared back at him, sharp suit, clean lines, the man everyone knew. But tonight he didn't feel like that man. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something he didn't understand. Something real. Something terrifying. He turned off the lights and went to bed without checking his email for the first time in years. And just before he drifted into sleep, he saw the faces of 3 boys with wild curls and chalk-covered hands. And he knew this wasn't over. 3 days passed before Evan saw Claire again. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't reached out. But every minute since that conversation in the park had pressed on him like weight he couldn't put down. He went through the motions of his daily life, meetings, calls, documents, all flawlessly executed, but nothing felt the same. His focus slipped during boardroom discussions. He forgot names. He stared too long at pictures of playground developments in one of his company's urban renewal proposals. Every child's face reminded him of the 3 boys who weren't his, but somehow already lived inside his thoughts. He didn't fully understand why. He just knew that something had cracked open inside him, and now it refused to close. That Friday, his car turned toward the park on instinct more than intent. He had no idea if they'd be there. It was late afternoon, the golden hour where the sun draped itself across the city like honey. The playground came into view, and there they were, just like before. The boys were climbing the jungle gym, yelling to each other with the wild energy only 6-year-olds possessed. And Claire was on the same bench, her posture more alert this time. She noticed him the moment he stepped out of the car, and though her body tensed, she didn't look away. He walked over slowly, without an agenda. He had nothing rehearsed. She stood before he even reached her, brushing her palms against her jeans like she needed to prepare herself for impact. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," she said. "I wasn't sure I was coming." They looked at each other for a moment. Not like strangers, not like old lovers either. Like two people finally realizing they still knew the shapes of each other's silences. "I've been thinking," he started. "About them. About you. About what happened." Claire folded her arms, not defensively, but out of the need to hold something in place. "You don't owe us anything, Evan. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you?" He took a breath, long and deep, and for once in his life, he didn't try to edit the emotion out of his voice. "Because I don't want to walk away. I'm not asking for anything. I can't pretend it didn't happen. That I didn't see you. That I didn't see them." She softened slightly but still didn't fully let go. "They're good kids. You don't need to get involved just to ease some guilt or curiosity." "I'm not curious," he said. "I'm drawn." Claire looked down, visibly shaken by the honesty in his words. "They've never had anyone," she said after a pause. "Not really. It's just been me. And I've done my best. But I've always known something was missing." "I'm not trying to fill a gap," Evan said carefully. "I'm just trying to be present in a moment I didn't see coming. Maybe it means something. Maybe it doesn't. But it feels real." They sat in silence for a while, watching the boys play. One of them, the middle child, slipped off the edge of the slide and landed hard on his knees. He didn't cry, but he looked around quickly, eyes wide with that sudden need for comfort. Before Claire could move, Evan stood and jogged over, crouching beside the boy without hesitation. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay, champ?" The boy nodded, blinking fast. Evan brushed the dirt from his jeans and smiled. "Tough one, huh?" The boy gave a small, surprised grin. Evan offered a fist bump, which the boy returned like it was the most natural thing in the world. Claire watched from a distance, something in her chest tightening. When Evan returned, she looked at him differently. "You knew exactly what to do," she said. "I had no idea what I was doing. And that's exactly why it worked." They left the park together. Not as a couple, not with any decisions made, but with something unspoken taking root between them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a beginning. It was an opening. A moment where maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't as closed as they thought. The days that followed were nothing like Evan had experienced before. He had lived a life of structure, of well-oiled calendars and appointments booked months in advance, where every moment was accounted for. But suddenly, his world became filled with spontaneity and noise, small, joyful chaos he didn't know he needed. He didn't make any formal declaration to Claire, didn't ask permission to enter their lives in any official way. He simply started showing up. Sometimes it was in the late afternoon at the park, other times it was with a bag of groceries when she looked too tired to cook. Once, he arrived with art supplies after hearing one of the boys say he wished they had better markers. He didn't try to impress them. He didn't ask for their attention. He just made himself present. And it was that presence, quiet and steady, that began to change everything. Claire didn't say much in those early days. She didn't ask him what he wanted. She didn't define boundaries. But she watched. Closely. She saw how he knelt down when the boys talked to him, how he remembered who liked what color, how he instinctively stepped between them and the street when they walked, even when she forgot to. There were moments when she caught herself smiling at him without realizing it, moments when she almost reached for his hand and then stopped herself. She wasn't ready for trust. But she was beginning to believe he meant what he had said. The boys, for their part, accepted Evan in the way only children can, purely and without question. They didn't know what he had done or failed to do in the past. They didn't care. He was there now, and that was enough. They asked him to read to them at night when he stayed late. They dragged him into their board game arguments and demanded he be the referee. They called him Evan at first, but then one of them, the youngest by 2 minutes, slipped and called him Dad during a game of tag. The word hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning neither of them dared acknowledge. Evan didn't correct him. He just smiled and kept playing, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. One evening, Evan stayed after dinner. The boys were upstairs, bathing, and the house was filled with the sound of running water and laughter echoing down the hallway. Claire was washing dishes, her back to him, and he offered to dry. They worked in silence at first, their movements in rhythm, the domesticity of it both strange and familiar. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't expect you to stay this long. I didn't expect to want to." Claire set down a glass and turned to look at him. "They're starting to get attached. So am I." Her lips parted slightly, the breath catching in her throat. "I don't want them to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt." "I'm not leaving," he said. "I don't know what this is yet, or what it's going to become. But I know I want to be in it." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to find the flaw in his sincerity. But she didn't find it. And for the first time since he returned to her life, she let herself believe this might not end the way everything else had. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep and the house had gone still, Claire walked Evan to the door. He turned before stepping out, as if waiting for her to say something, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For showing up." Evan looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was simple. Gentle. A promise without words. And when he left, the silence he left behind no longer felt like absence. It felt like hope. A month passed, and Evan had become more than a visitor, more than a drop-in presence around dinner time or on weekend afternoons. Without announcing it or even fully realizing when it had happened, he had become woven into the rhythm of their lives. He knew which of the boys liked peanut butter and which one hated it. He knew who needed the night light on and who insisted on sleeping with the curtains wide open. He could tell which footsteps on the stairs belonged to which child and how to tell their laughter apart, even though their voices often overlapped. He had memorized the lyrics to songs he'd never imagined singing and had learned to navigate mornings full of mismatched socks, cereal spills, and last-minute backpack hunts like it was second nature. Claire watched him with a mix of disbelief and quiet admiration. He had not only shown up, but stayed, and more than that, he participated. He didn't just bring gifts or offer token attention. He changed diapers when needed, showed up at parent-teacher meetings, helped with school projects that involved far too much glitter. He sat through endless conversations about dinosaurs and space rockets and listened, really listened, when one of the boys had a bad day and didn't know how to explain it. She saw him grow into a role that neither of them had discussed out loud, but that he was stepping into with every day that passed. They still hadn't talked about labels. Not about what they were to each other now, or what they would be. There were no declarations, no late-night confessions of love. It was quieter than that, deeper somehow. She felt it when he brought her coffee before she even asked, when he stood next to her during bedtime stories and didn't rush off afterward. She felt it when their hands brushed and neither of them pulled away. The love wasn't loud, it was steady, and she had never trusted anything more. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the living room filled with that soft, golden light, Claire walked in to find Evan lying on the floor, 3 heads resting on his chest as he told them a story from memory. No book. No pictures. Just his voice and their trust. One of the boys had fallen asleep, arm draped across Evan's stomach, mouth slightly open. Another was barely keeping his eyes open. The third stared up at the ceiling, listening intently. Evan glanced up when he saw Claire and smiled, not moving, not wanting to break the spell. She stood there longer than she meant to, arms folded, heart aching with a kind of gratitude she didn't know how to express. Later, when the boys had been tucked into bed and the house was quiet again, she found Evan in the kitchen, rinsing out cups they had left behind. "You're good at this," she said softly. He didn't turn around, just nodded. "I didn't know I would be." "They adore you." "I adore them." She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "And what about me?" He finally turned, meeting her gaze with a kind of honesty that made her breath catch. "You scare me," he said. "Because you're the first thing in my life I didn't plan for that I never want to lose." Claire stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, until she was standing right in front of him. She rested her hand on his chest, over the place where his heart beat steady and strong. "Then don't leave." "I wasn't going to," he whispered. She kissed him then, not out of impulse, not because the moment demanded it, but because her whole body already knew he belonged. The kiss wasn't rushed or fiery. It was sure. Certain. Familiar in a way that only something deeply earned can feel. That night, they didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. It was already unfolding between them in the smallest moments, in the quiet smiles, in the way they moved through the house together as if they'd always been one unit. And for the first time in years, Claire slept deeply, knowing that someone was still there when she opened her eyes. Evan had never thought of himself as someone who needed a family. He'd spent years building walls around his life, structuring everything with purpose, productivity, and precision. But now, as he sat at the small kitchen table in Claire's house, watching one of the boys make faces into his glass of orange juice while the others argued over which dinosaur would win in a fight, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride or peace exactly, it was fuller than that. It was a quiet, aching joy. He didn't belong here because of obligation. He belonged here because something in his soul had shifted, cracked open, and let real life rush in. The days had blurred into something beautiful. Mornings were chaotic but warm. Evenings were filled with bedtime stories and the soft rhythm of shared routines. Claire had started leaving little notes on the fridge when she left early for work, reminders for the boys, but sometimes with a quick, "thank you," or a drawn heart for Evan. It was never dramatic, never too much, but enough to remind him that this was no longer temporary. He was here, and she saw him. He began to notice the smallest things about each boy. How Theo, the loudest and most imaginative, bit his nails when he was nervous. How Max, always pretending to be brave, would quietly seek out Evan's hand when the movie got scary. And Ben, the youngest by minutes, but the most introspective, liked to sit beside Evan without speaking, just to be close. It wasn't about big moments. It was about thousands of tiny ones. That's what built trust. That's what made them a family. One evening, after a long day at the park and a living room fort building competition that ended with pillow casualties and endless laughter, Claire pulled Evan aside. The boys were upstairs, supposedly getting ready for bed, which meant they were likely still half-dressed and negotiating toothbrush time. She looked serious but not tense, her fingers fidgeting slightly with the hem of her sweater. "There's something I want to talk to you about," she said, her voice careful. Evan straightened, immediately attentive. "Of course. What is it?" She took a breath. "They've been asking questions. Not about their biological father, not directly. But, they're trying to make sense of who you are. And I think it's time we give them some kind of answer." Evan nodded slowly. "What do you think they need?" "I think they need to know they can count on you. That you're not going to disappear one day. That you're not just a very nice guest who reads stories and plays soccer in the yard." He hesitated, not because he disagreed, but because the truth of it hit him harder than he expected. "I don't want them to wonder," he said. "And I don't want them to feel like they have to earn me being here. I'm here because I want to be." Claire met his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we make that official." The words hung in the air, not as a demand but as a possibility. Evan felt the weight of them settle into his chest, not as pressure, but as purpose. He thought about how much had changed, how much he had changed, and how much these boys already meant to him. And then he saw something in Claire's eyes, a flicker of hope mixed with fear, the fragile courage of a woman who had done it alone for so long and was still learning how to let someone in. "I want to adopt them," he said quietly. "If that's something you and they would want. I know I can't replace anyone. I don't want to. But I'd be proud to be their father." Claire didn't cry. She just exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. Then she reached out and touched his face, her thumb brushing the edge of his jaw like she was memorizing him all over again. "They would be lucky to have you," she said. "But so would I." Upstairs, the boys erupted into a fit of laughter that echoed through the house like music. Evan looked toward the ceiling, then back at Claire, his hand wrapping around hers. "Then let's do it," he whispered. "Let's give them that security. Let's give them all of us." And just like that, without ceremony or witnesses, the foundation of their future was set. Not on perfection, not on blood, but on love freely chosen. On presence. On staying. And for the first time in his life, Evan wasn't building something for the world to see. He was building something that would last even when no one else was looking. The morning of the adoption hearing was quiet, almost strangely so. The sky outside was soft with early light, and the usual rush of shoes slamming against floors and cereal spilling on counters was replaced with something gentler, more intentional. Claire had helped the boys into their little button-down shirts and combed through their wild curls, trying to keep them in some form of order, though the energy in them made it nearly impossible. Evan stood nearby, adjusting their tiny collars, kneeling down to tie Max's shoe, smiling softly as Theo declared he was going to "tell the judge we already like you so she says yes faster." There was nervousness in the air, yes, but there was also excitement. The kind that lives in children when they know something important is about to happen, even if they don't fully understand it. Claire watched Evan as he moved through the house with steady hands and a calm that hadn't always been there. He had grown into this role not with declarations or grand gestures, but with every small choice to stay, to listen, to love without needing to be asked. She could still remember the man who had once lived in glass towers and met the world through polished schedules and polite detachment. But this version of him, this man in front of her now, was softer without being weaker, stronger because he had chosen to lean in, not run. At the courthouse, everything moved slowly at first. Paperwork. Waiting. A small family courtroom with a warm judge who smiled kindly at the boys and asked them easy questions to help them feel comfortable. Claire sat beside Evan, her hand gripping his under the table, fingers interlaced tightly. The boys sat in chairs too big for them, their feet dangling, their legs swinging in time. When asked if they understood what was happening, they each nodded with eager certainty. And when the judge asked why they wanted Evan to be their dad, Theo answered quickly and without hesitation, because he already is. Claire's heart twisted, and Evan didn't hide the way his throat tightened as he reached to gently tousle Theo's hair. The judge smiled at that, then turned to Evan with a warmth that made the room feel less like a courtroom and more like a home being made in real time. She asked Evan why he wanted to take this step, and his voice, though quiet, held no uncertainty. "Because I love them. Because they are already mine in every way that matters. And I want them to know that I'm not going anywhere." The moment the judge signed the papers, it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A final flourish of pen to paper. A few official words. But what it meant, what it changed, was everything. Evan was their father now. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. And even though nothing about their day-to-day lives would suddenly shift, the sense of completeness that settled over them was undeniable. Back at the house, they celebrated with pancakes, balloons taped haphazardly to the wall, and hand-drawn cards from the boys that said things like, "Best dad ever," and "Thanks for choosing us." Evan read each one like it was a contract more sacred than anything he'd ever signed before. Claire made coffee, then stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching the four of them pile onto the couch in a tangle of limbs and laughter, a living, breathing portrait of everything she never dared to imagine years ago when she held 3 newborns in her arms and wondered how she would ever survive. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to sleep, Evan walked into the bedroom and found Claire holding a small box in her hands. When he opened it, he found a silver ring, simple and unpolished, with the inside engraved with 4 initials, hers, the boys, and his. She didn't say anything, just held it out, and he slipped it onto his finger without question, without needing any promises spoken aloud. He looked at her and said, "I didn't know life could be like this." And she replied, "That's because we hadn't built it yet." They curled into each other, the house quiet around them, the world soft beyond the windows. And in that stillness, in the deep fullness of what they had created together, Evan realized that this messy, loud, perfectly imperfect life, was the only thing he had ever truly wanted. He hadn't found it in wealth or power or silence. He had found it in chalk drawings, mismatched socks, whispered bedtime stories, and a woman who had once been his past, and had now become his forever. What makes the ending of this story so emotionally satisfying to me is how quietly powerful it is. There's no dramatic cliffhanger, no over-the-top declarations, just the slow and steady culmination of choices, small, intentional, deeply human choices. Evan doesn't become a father because he has to or because it's the right thing on paper. He becomes one because his heart genuinely shifts. And that shift, for a man so used to controlling everything, is massive. Claire, on the other hand, learns to let someone in after years of carrying everything on her own. She doesn't surrender her strength, she expands it by allowing trust to grow again. The beauty of their reunion isn't in rewriting the past, but in writing a new future on their own terms. And the boys? They don't fully grasp the weight of what happened in the courtroom, but they feel it. They feel chosen. And that feeling, that they're worth showing up for, worth staying for, is the very heart of the story. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's better. It's earned, grounded, and real. It reminds us that family isn't always built by blood or by plan, but by presence, love, and the willingness to stay when it's hard.